A hand rose slowly over the tin plate, thin fingers, skin like paper. She wasn't asking for seconds. She was pointing. At the steak, her eyes wide, trembling. Not with hunger, but disbelief. The mess hall had fallen silent. A dozen Japanese POW women sat frozen, their first meal in Texas steaming in front of them. But it was the steak, thick, pink-centered, sizzling with salt and butter, that stole the breath from every throat. One woman pointed at hers and whispered something in Japanese. The cowboy watching from the doorway thought he'd misread her. Then another pointed too. Then another. "Is it for us?" one finally asked through a translator. The cowboy just nodded. And then the tears. Not loud sobs. Just quiet, shaking hands covering mouths. For women who had spent years being told they were expendable, this wasn't just meat. It was disbelief, dignity, and devastation served on a white enamel plate. The smell of steak filled the room. But the real story was the silence. The cowboys stood at the edges of the mess hall, their hats in their hands, watching like men who'd accidentally stepped into a church. They weren't used to reverence. Not like this, not in a dining room with folding chairs and tin trays. But something about the way those Japanese women stared at the plates in front of them made even the loudest ranch hands forget their boots were muddy and their belts creaked. One woman, her braid undone and eyes sunken from months of hunger, simply rested a trembling hand on the edge of her tray. She hadn't touched the meat yet. She just looked at it like it was an altar. And she wasn't sure if she was allowed to pray. No one spoke. The clang of utensils hadn't yet begun. The hiss of butter on beef still lingered in the rafters, like smoke from a battlefield that hadn't cooled. The room was warm, full of scents they hadn't known in years: salt, fat, real onions. But the warmth couldn't reach the tight knots inside their chests. For many of them, this was the first enclosed space that didn't smell of disinfectant or gunpowder. That alone made their stomachs tighten with suspicion. The Americans had said nothing about dinner. They'd been led into the hall without barking or shoves, just a quiet line of motion, women in ill-fitting uniforms and shoes tied with string. They'd expected punishment, or at the very least, cold silence. They had not expected steak, and yet here it was, thick slices of it, grilled and pink at the center, placed beside piles of soft bread and mashed potatoes rich with butter. Real butter, not lard, not oil, not powdered substitute. Butter. A few leaned back from the trays, whispering in Japanese, voices low and urgent. Was it a trap? Was it poisoned? One woman blinked hard, whispering the word shinu, to die. Another thought she recognized the meal from a dream she used to have when her belly shrank smaller than her ribs. A steak, a warm room, and the terrible ache of needing to believe it was real. But dreams always faded. And this was too much. One by one, they pointed. Not to ask, not to demand, just to make sure it was truly there. The cowboys shifted awkwardly. One cleared his throat, rubbed the back of his neck, and whispered to the cook behind the line, "They don't know it's for them." The cook, a barrel-chested man with grease on his apron, looked up and met the POW's eyes. He offered a nod, slow and deliberate. "It's theirs," he said. "All of it." Another woman picked up her fork, hand trembling like a leaf in wind, and touched the meat as if it might bite her back. She glanced at the cowboy near the door, eyes wet, and whispered something too soft to translate. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her face. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind you give a frightened horse. "Easy now. It's safe." Then came the first bite. She chewed slowly, reverently, as if her mouth had forgotten the mechanics of fullness. Her eyes fluttered, not from pleasure, though the taste must have been dizzying, but from the sudden weight of everything she had lost to arrive at this moment. The warmth of the meat filled her like a memory. Her mother's voice, her father's hands, her brother, gone in the firebombing. None of them had tasted meat like this in years, perhaps never. Another woman began to eat. Then another. Then another. The room did not explode into chatter or laughter. There were no cries of joy. There was only the soft sound of chewing, of tin forks tapping against trays, of breaths held and released. For the women, steak was not just nourishment. It was a betrayal of everything they'd been taught. The enemy feeds us. The enemy treats us like people. The enemy serves steak. The cowboys watched with furrowed brows. They had expected prisoners. They had expected the glare of hatred or the weight of defiance. They had not expected tears, or the sight of grown women holding forks like sacred relics. One young rancher leaned over to another and murmured, "We're feeding ghosts." His friend, still holding his hat like it might anchor him to the floor, replied, "No, we're bringing 'em back to life." And in that barn-shaped mess hall, somewhere between the scent of sizzling beef and the echo of distant war, something broke and something else began. Before the steak, before Texas, before the strange quiet of American kindness, there was only silence. Hannah had learned that silence was survival. Not just in the literal sense, in the bomb shelters, beneath the roar of sirens, where even a cough might draw fire, but in the cultural sense, in the code, in Bushido. From the moment she was conscripted as a field nurse at 16, Hannah understood that her voice belonged to the empire. Her body belonged to duty. Her hunger, her fear, her grief, all of it had to be swallowed. She remembered the training barracks, the paper-thin walls where girls lay shoulder to shoulder, shivering under stiff blankets and memorizing the phrases carved into wooden plaques. Endure without complaint. Surrender is disgrace. The emperor is father, mother, God. Every morning they shouted these words into the air like prayers. Every night they recited them again, with mouths cracked from thirst and hearts hollowed by obedience. Hannah didn't question it. No one did. Not after seeing what happened to the girl who hesitated during drills. She was slapped hard enough to draw blood and made to kneel in gravel for hours. "Compassion is for the weak," the instructor had barked, and the weak serve no purpose. That phrase would echo in Hannah's skull for years, long after the empire had fallen, long after the stake. By the time she was sent to a makeshift military hospital near Nagoya, Hannah had stopped crying. She stitched wounds with trembling fingers, cleaned blood from stretchers, and learned how to wipe a dying man's face without blinking. The nurses around her were little more than children, same as her girls turned to cogs in a dying machine. They whispered among themselves at night about the bombings, about the shortages, about how rice had turned into bark and sugar into dust. But they never spoke of doubt, not openly. Doubt was more dangerous than hunger. They heard rumors, of course, that American prisoners were treated better than their own, that Allied leaflets showed smiling faces, hot meals, open hands, but no one believed them. Or rather, they couldn't afford to. One nurse tore up a leaflet and burned it before anyone else could see. "It's a lie," she muttered. "It has to be." To believe the enemy could show mercy meant unlearning everything they had been taught. Hannah's own brother, Satoru, had died believing the same thing she did, that surrender was shame, that survival was treason. He had written her one letter before being sent to the front. In it, he told her, "If I fall, do not mourn me. Mourn only if I break." He was 17. His body was never found. She kept that letter folded inside her blouse the day she boarded the transport to the coast. The war was over by then, though no one had told her directly. The hospital had emptied. The shouting had stopped. Officers vanished like ghosts. A nurse whispered the unthinkable. The emperor had spoken, in his own voice, and said they must accept the unacceptable. They were rounded up, not by shouting soldiers, but by quiet ones, American Marines with strange expressions, not glee or anger, but something in between, curiosity, weariness, maybe even pity. Hannah didn't know how to process any of it. The silence had always been armor. Now it became a shroud. They crossed the ocean on a ship that smelled of steel and soap. They slept in bunks with real mattresses. They were fed, not generously, but enough. Some girls vomited from the shock of rich food. Others wept in the dark, unable to believe they were still alive. Hannah ate quietly. She said nothing, not when they landed in America, not when the cowboy handed her the tray, not even when she saw the steak and remembered that her father had only eaten it once in a restaurant, on payday, before the war swallowed their lives whole. Her silence wasn't fear anymore. It was history. It was ritual. It was the last thing she could still control. So when she lifted her fork in that barn-shaped mess hall, she did it slowly, like a ritual, like she was breaking something sacred. She placed the meat in her mouth, chewed, swallowed, and something cracked, not just in her, but in the idea of who she was supposed to be. It wasn't just steak. It was the weight of everything that had come before it, everything stripped from her, everything burned into her, everything left behind in a country collapsing under its own silence. Hannah had grown up believing that rice was enough, that honor was more filling than soup, and that loyalty to the emperor could make a stomach forget it was empty. But war had a way of starving both body and belief. By the final year, there was almost nothing left. The markets had vanished into smoke. Shops once lined with noodles and pickles now stood with shutters bolted, windows broken. People whispered of food as if it were myth, sugar was a dream, salt a memory. Even rice, the backbone of Japan, had become rare enough to hoard in cloth bundles and count grain by grain. Hannah's mother had once soaked acorns in water for days, trying to leach out the bitterness. Her younger sister coughed up bark after swallowing it in desperation. There was no shame in it, only silence. Most days, Hannah worked 12 hours in the hospital and returned to find nothing waiting but a cold tin bowl, dandelions, boiled and mashed, half a potato, skin and all, a gray ball of barley, sticky and sour. But the worst was the rice substitute, shaped like rice, but made of chestnut husks and wheat husks and sometimes little more than shredded weeds. It crumbled in the mouth like ash. It smelled of paper, but she ate it anyway. They all did. Her last meal in Japan had been a handful of real rice, white, soft, clumped with sweat and salt, and one strip of seaweed wrapped around it like a ribbon on a corpse. She remembered crouching behind a fallen fence post, the sirens still echoing across Nagoya, and lifting that rice ball to her lips with shaking fingers. She ate it slowly, eyes fixed on the distant cloud where her neighborhood used to be. Smoke coiled upward. Her sister was somewhere beneath it. Her mother, too. She didn't cry. She finished the rice and stood up. Then came the orders. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. But surrender didn't feel like peace. It felt like vanishing. They were taken to the docks in silence. No goodbye, no fanfare. The ship that waited wasn't a prison hulk, it was something stranger. American. Clean. Functional. The bunks were made of steel and smelled like oil. The food was rationed, measured, placed on trays. They were fed 3 times a day. Most of the women didn't know what to make of it. Some refused to eat. Others hoarded bread crusts under their pillows. A few vomited from the shock of real butter or the richness of beans. Hannah forced herself to eat half portions, never finishing anything. It felt like theft. No one explained where they were going. They just floated across the water, watching their country disappear behind them like a burnt page. The ocean was endless. The air below deck never changed. They spoke little. No one had the words. When they finally docked, it was not into gunfire or dogs. It was into sunlight, bright and clean and unbearable. The air smelled of salt and pine, not smoke. They were moved again onto trains, then onto trucks, until the countryside changed. Green fields, barbed wire, a windmill, cows. It felt more like a painting than a prison. The gates of the Texas ranch camp stood open when they arrived, guarded but not snarling. The buildings were wooden, low, warm in color. A man tipped his hat. Another offered a drink of water. No orders were shouted. No one spat. One girl whispered that perhaps this wasn't a camp at all, but a mistake. Hannah didn't respond. Her stomach ached from the long ride. But she had learned not to ask for food. Hunger had become habit. She didn't expect kindness to follow. Then came the steak, and then came the silence again. Not from fear this time, but from not knowing what came next. Hannah sat still with her tray, the steak before her already cooled at the edges. She had seen other women begin to eat hesitant, trembling, some crying without sound, but she couldn't yet bring herself to move. The fork in her hand felt foreign, heavy. Its clean, polished surface reflected her hollow face back at her like a stranger. She didn't know where to start. The meat was thick, soft-looking, glistening in its juices. Too large to eat in one bite, too rich to believe. A cowboy nearby, young, maybe not even 20, watched her from the side of the mess hall. His sleeves were rolled up, his skin tanned and freckled from the sun. He wasn't armed. His rifle was slung behind the door, forgotten. He saw her sitting there, unmoving, holding the fork as if it might snap between her fingers. He stepped forward slowly, boots scuffing against the wooden floor. No one noticed except Hannah. He crouched beside her, hands raised like he was approaching a skittish horse. No words, just a gentle smile and a nod toward the tray. Then he picked up a spare fork from a nearby stack, sat on his heels, and pantomimed. He mimed the gesture of cutting two fingers, tracing the edge of the meat, a pretend knife in his palm slicing downward, slow and exaggerated. Then he mimed picking up a bite, lifting it to his mouth and chewing. He pointed at the steak on her tray and nodded again, like asking permission, like saying, "It's okay. You can do this." Hannah blinked. Something in her chest loosened. She looked down at her own fork, then back at him. He reached over and, with a gentle tap, guided her hand to the edge of the meat. The metal was cool against her skin. She pressed the fork down, just as he'd shown her. Then he mimed again. A sawing motion, slow, patient. It felt absurd. It felt ridiculous. And yet, she did it. The steak yielded easily. It came apart in fibers she hadn't seen in years. Not stringy bits of tendon like in the war rations, but soft, pink, juicy muscle. She cut a piece, then another. The cowboy sat back on his heels, arms on his knees, watching quietly like a man who wasn't sure if he'd done too much. She lifted the fork. Bit, chewed, and then, barely audible, she laughed. It wasn't a full laugh. Not yet, but it was the shape of one. A sound she hadn't heard come from her own mouth in months, maybe longer. The absurdity of it, the lesson, the pantomime, the cowboy kneeling next to her tray like a schoolboy playing charades had pierced something deeper than fear. The moment felt weightless, like wind after a storm. She looked up at him, eyes shining, and nodded. He grinned. "There it is," he said, even though she couldn't understand. Then he stood, tipped his hat, and walked away. That one gesture, just a fork, just a smile, did what no guard tower, no order, no ration could do. It broke the wall. Not down, but enough for air to get in. Around the room, other women had seen. One mimicked the motion she'd witnessed, timidly cutting her steak with new confidence. Another giggled behind her hand, then sobered instantly, as if she had done something wrong. But no punishment came, no scolding. Only the scrape of forks and the slow bloom of something new, a shared silent understanding that maybe this place did not run on the rules they had known. And somewhere in the back of the mess hall, another cowboy chuckled. "Well, I'll be," he muttered to his friend. "She just needed a little help with the math." His friend raised a brow. "What math?" The cowboy grinned. "Steak divided by fork equals trust." No one laughed, but Hannah did, quietly, under her breath, and for the first time in what felt like another lifetime, she kept eating not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to. But that night, when the lights dimmed and the mess hall emptied, hunger was no longer the loudest thing in the room. The warmth of full bellies settled awkwardly in their frames, like wearing someone else's coat, soft, comforting, but unfamiliar enough to make them restless. Hannah lay on her bunk, the sheets surprisingly clean, the mattress not thin enough to feel like punishment. The ceiling above her was wooden, with knotted beams and spiderwebs in the corners. No rats, no screaming, no marching boots, only the sound of breathing and crying. It was quiet at first, muffled sobs into pillows, sleeves pulled over mouths, trying not to be heard. Not from pain, not from fear, but from the weight of it all, the shame of still being alive, the guilt of eating when others had not. Hannah turned her face toward the wall. She hadn't cried in years. Not when the bombs came. Not when her sister disappeared into the fire. Not even when they were told Japan had surrendered and everything they believed in turned to ash. But now, in a quiet American bunkhouse that smelled faintly of soap and hay, her chest ached with something unfamiliar, a fracture, a feeling. Across the room, one of the girls was writing. Not openly, but secretly, curled over a piece of paper like a prisoner sketching escape. Her name was Aiko, thin, bookish, always whispering to herself in lines of poetry. She had found a stub of a pencil tucked inside a cracked floorboard, and now she wrote by moonlight, the words tiny and sharp. Hannah could see the concentration on her face, even from the dark. Later, when Aiko climbed down from her bunk and returned quietly, she slid the folded paper beneath her mattress. Hannah would find it days later, when the floor was being swept. The note was short, just 2 lines, in neat characters. "They fed us like humans." What does that mean? It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was an echo. The women didn't talk about it out loud. Not the steak, not the cowboy, not the laughter. To speak of it was to admit something had changed, and change was dangerous. Change meant letting go. Letting go meant betrayal, not of their country, but of the silence they had sworn to carry. Bushido didn't teach them how to process kindness. It taught them how to die. It taught them that survival was not noble unless it came with service, that being captured was dishonor, that being fed by the enemy was worse than defeat. It was a humiliation that reached into the soul and pulled the roots loose. So they kept still, stoic. Some turned toward the walls, faces blank. Others folded their hands over their stomachs, trying not to feel the fullness. A few whispered old proverbs like prayers. A woman's silence is her dignity. A bowed head protects the heart. The emperor sees even what is hidden. Hannah stared at the ceiling for a long time, then at the faint shape of the barn roof, visible through the window. The stars outside were too many. In Nagoya, the sky had always been choked with smoke. Here, it was open, too open. It made her feel small. She rolled onto her side, clutching her thin blanket. The steak still lingered in her body, not as taste, but as memory. She could feel it in her bones, in the strange looseness of her limbs. She wondered what her father would say. If he knew, if he'd call her weak or lost. She wondered if shame could survive this kind of mercy, or if mercy, given freely, was its own kind of punishment. In the darkness, someone whispered, "Why are they feeding us?" No one answered. They just lay there, in the night of full stomachs, haunted by something heavier than hunger. By morning, the taste had not left Hannah's mouth. It lingered like a ghost salt, fat, heat rising unbidden when she swallowed, when she breathed, when she closed her eyes. She washed her face at the basin, cold water shocking her skin, but the memory remained. Not just the steak itself, but what it unlocked. Food, she realized, was not merely sustenance. In a country starved into obedience, it had become spiritual. Meat was not eaten. It was remembered. She could still see her father at the low table, years before the war, sleeves rolled up, laughing as he cut thin slices of beef for a family celebration. The meat had been scarce even then, but they had shared it carefully, dipping each piece in salt like it was sacred. Her mother had warned them not to waste even a grain. "Salt is work," she said. "Fat is life." Hannah had not understood at the time. She did now. The war took those flavors first. Salt disappeared. Oil followed. Meat vanished entirely, replaced by rumors. A neighbor once traded a wedding kimono for a handful of dried fish. Another boiled shoe leather until it softened enough to chew. When Hannah first learned that horses were being slaughtered, she felt shame and relief in equal measure. Shame for the thought, relief for the calories. That was how the war taught them to think. So when the steak returned not thin, not rationed, not begged for, but placed freely on a plate, it did something violent to her insides. It wasn't pleasure. It was rebellion. Her tongue remembered before her mind could stop it. The salt struck first, sharp and electric. Then the fat bloomed, coating her mouth, carrying warmth into places that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Her body reacted before ideology could intervene. That betrayal tasted like life. At breakfast, there was bacon. The smell alone made several women turn away. Hannah sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. Bacon had been a word from childhood, from markets, from laughter. Now it lay in front of her, curling and glossy, popping faintly in its own grease. She felt heat creep up her neck. To enjoy this would be obscene. To refuse it would be foolish. She picked up a piece and ate it slowly, eyes down. Shame followed immediately, thick and suffocating. Across the ocean, her mother might be boiling weeds. Her sister, if she was alive, might be gnawing on bark. That thought lodged in Hannah's throat like a bone. Each bite here was an imbalance. Each swallow a quiet theft. She imagined writing home, trying to explain. There were no words that could cross that distance without wounding someone. The women spoke of it only in fragments. "It tastes like before," one whispered. "I feel sick," another said, meaning not her stomach, but her conscience. A third laughed too loudly and then stopped. Hand clamped over her mouth as if she'd sinned. Enjoyment felt dangerous. It felt disloyal. And yet Their bodies leaned into it all the same. Hunger had trained them to accept whatever came. Their hearts lagged behind. The cowboys noticed the tension but did not comment. They served breakfast, wiped tables, refilled cups. One man salted his own food heavily and then paused, glancing at the women as if suddenly aware of the luxury of choice. He pushed the salt shaker farther down the table, closer to them, then thought better of it and left it where it was. Compassion, Hannah learned, could also be awkward. Later, assigned light chores, she found herself near the kitchen. The smell of rendered fat hung in the air. A pan hissed softly. She watched as a cook scraped bacon grease into a tin for later use. Later use. The idea stunned her. Fat, not as treasure to be hoarded, but as something abundant enough to save. The war had taught her that nothing came later. Everything was now or never. That afternoon, guilt settled deeper. It followed her like a shadow as she folded laundry, as she swept the floor, as she drank clean water without counting the sips. She felt heavier not just in body, but in responsibility. To survive better than those she loved felt like a betrayal without a crime. And yet, when dinner came, she ate again. Not because she was weak, not because she had forgotten, but because the taste had reminded her of something the war had tried to erase, that she was alive. That life, when offered without cruelty, carried its own meaning. She ate with tears in her eyes and salt on her tongue, holding both at once. Salt and shame, fat and memory, compassion, served hot. The next morning, the women were called to the courtyard, not to be counted, not to be drilled, but to be given chores. It was the kind of work no one had expected: feeding chickens, sweeping barns, sorting linens. Not orders barked through clenched jaws, but instructions spoken with simple words and even simpler gestures. The guards stood back. The cowboys leaned on fence posts. There was no suspicion in the air, only sun and dust and the smell of livestock. For the first time in years, Hannah's work did not revolve around war. She wasn't sterilizing bloody bandages or sorting morphine under candlelight. She wasn't rationing painkillers or holding down boys' missing limbs. Now she was sweeping a wooden floor, folding sun-dried sheets, stacking plates. It was mundane. It was repetitive. But there was something healing in that rhythm, something quietly sacred about doing something that didn't end in silence or death. One of the women, Nao, was asked to help in the kitchen. She had been a cook once, back in Osaka. Her hands had a memory that hadn't faded. She said little, but her movements were precise. Peeling potatoes, measuring flour. She handled the utensils with the reverence of someone holding family heirlooms. That's when it happened. She was stirring marinade in a wide metal bowl when she spotted the cut of meat sitting nearby. Thick, red, marbled, a steak. She froze, spoon in hand, her shoulders tensed, her breath hitched. The scent of vinegar and herbs rose into her nose and cracked something open. She didn't cry loudly. Just tears, sudden and uninvited, rolling down her face like rain off a roof. She set the spoon down slowly, as if it were glass, and turned away. A cowboy who had been passing through paused at the doorway. He didn't know what to say. She didn't expect him to. After a moment, he fumbled in his back pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and stepped forward, hesitantly. Not close enough to offend, just close enough to offer. She didn't take it at first. Then she did. Their eyes met for half a second. Something passed between them, not words, not apology, not explanation, just a recognition that the war had ended in some places before it had ended in others. And here, in this quiet kitchen in the heart of Texas, it was still ending, piece by piece. Back outside, Hannah watched from a distance as Nao returned to work. She didn't mention the tears. None of them did. But something had shifted. To prepare a meal meant control, meant participation, meant choosing to give instead of always being the one to receive under force. It was a different kind of nourishment, one that worked in both directions. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the barn, the women hung laundry together. One of the cowboys passed by, with a bucket of oats for the horses. He paused near them, scratched the back of his neck, and said, in slow English, "Dinner's beans tonight. No steak. Sorry, ladies." They didn't understand the words, but he smiled. And someone, Reiko, the youngest of them, laughed. Not mockingly, just openly, without fear. The cowboy grinned wider and walked on. Small things like that began to happen more often. An extra slice of cornbread, a gesture to sit down when they looked uncertain, a moment where two people stood beside one another not as enemies, not as strangers, but as workers in the same dust and sun. Even the way they handed tools changed, less like passing orders, more like offering something with care. None of this erased what had come before. The bones of the war were still buried deep in each of them, beneath the smiles, beneath the silence. But now they buried those bones themselves, not in shame, but in soil that promised something new. Tomorrow, there would be more chores, more food, more small collisions of humanity. But for now, there was the scent of marinated steak rising into the beams of a quiet kitchen, and a handkerchief, folded once, thousands of miles away, on an island still reeling from surrender. A piece of thin paper arrived wrapped in secrecy. It bore no insignia, no flag, just a name written in delicate hand and a few lines of text that had survived the long journey west to east. Folded carefully, it had passed through Red Cross intermediaries, been stamped, screened, held up to light. Nothing in it spoke of battle plans, no troop positions, no coded messages. Just this: they fed us steak. We sleep in beds. No one shouts. There is laughter. I am confused. I am alive. The letter had been written weeks earlier by Aiko, the same girl who once tucked a message under her mattress in Texas. This one, though, she addressed to a cousin still living near Kobe. She hadn't expected it to go through. And in some ways, it didn't. Because in Tokyo, before it ever reached a home, it landed on a desk belonging to a colonel in the Interior Ministry, one of the few still holding rank in a government now stripped of its power, yet still clinging to fragments of control. His job was simple: read, redact, protect the narrative. But what he read was not sabotage, not betrayal. It was something worse: honesty. He read the letter twice, then again, then a fourth time, slower. The words were simple, but their implications roared like fire. Not because they accused the Americans of torture, but because they didn't. Because the girl described, in painful, soft detail, what it felt like to be fed by the enemy, and how that kindness had undone her more than cruelty ever could. The colonel stood up, stared out the window, and breathed through his nose. The city outside was rebuilding in fits and starts, half ruins, half shadows. The people still walked with heads low, shoulders tucked. Hunger still clung to them. And here, in his hand, was proof that their daughters, captured and shamed, were living better than they were. He could not allow it, but neither could he ignore it. He didn't destroy the letter. He made a copy. Then, in a room where censors gathered behind closed doors, he read it aloud. At first, there was silence, then a cough, then a muttered curse. One man stood up, eyes wet with rage. "She thanks them," he hissed. "She thanks them. For steak." But another man, a younger officer, freshly demobilized, shook his head. That distinction, what it meant was the danger. If prisoners could write of comfort, of decency, of something resembling peace, then the wall of hatred that had propped up their suffering might crack. And if it cracked, what was left to hold the people together? The letter was classified, its copy locked away. But it was not forgotten. It moved in whispers shared over drinks, between old friends, inside crumbling university halls. They spoke not just of stake, but of confusion, of how a nation could raise girls to die with honor, only to have them live with shame and kindness. In Kobe, the cousin never received the letter. But in Tokyo, a colonel stopped sleeping well. He had ordered death for years. Now, one letter, written in a neat, uncertain hand, haunted him more than blood ever did. He didn't know her face, didn't know the ranch, or the cowboy with the handkerchief, but he could picture the meal, could almost smell the steak, and it broke him in ways that no battle report ever had. That was the power of a letter, not to accuse, but to illuminate, not to destroy, but to ask, what if they're not monsters? What if they're just men? And sometimes that question is the sharpest weapon of all. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. The mess hall was quieter than usual that evening. It wasn't solemn, nor was it tense, just quiet in the way that comes when people have run out of things to fear, at least for a moment. The war had not vanished. The camps were still camps, but the edges had dulled. There were no guards yelling in the background, no boots scraping threats into the ground, just forks clinking against plates and the sound of steam hissing from a nearby pot. Nao sat near the end of the table, her hair pulled back with a piece of fabric she'd fashioned from a flour sack. The same cowboy who had once handed her a napkin now passed by with a tray of fresh bread. Their eyes met for a split second, like clock hands aligning. She didn't smile. He didn't speak. But the space between them softened. That night's dinner was steak again, smaller cuts, seared with onions, served beside boiled potatoes. It wasn't extravagance. It was routine now. That, in itself, was surreal. She didn't eat all of hers. Instead, Nao cut a thin slice, balancing it carefully on the dull edge of her fork. She looked down at it, then up at the cowboy still standing nearby, now pouring coffee for another worker. With barely a breath, she raised the fork in his direction. Not an offering, a gesture. He blinked. "Me?" he asked, pointing to himself, half laughing. She nodded, not smiling but insistent. Her arm didn't waver. He hesitated, glancing around. The other women were focused on their own meals. No one seemed to notice, or perhaps they noticed and chose to pretend otherwise. Slowly, the cowboy stepped forward, lowered his head just enough, and took the steak from her fork with his own. Not a bite he didn't eat from her utensil, but he accepted the piece and nodded. "Thank you," he said. Quiet enough to almost disappear beneath the chatter, Nao returned to her plate. The exchange lasted seconds, but something shifted in that space between gesture and reply. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something else, an act neither side had been trained for. A prisoner had fed a soldier. It reversed every image painted by war. And yet, here, no banners flew, no declarations were made. Only a piece of steak passed between hands that, in another time, might have held weapons. What was shared wasn't the meat. It was the humility in offering, the awkwardness in accepting, the recognition that in this strange place they were not entirely who they had once been. The cowboy wasn't there to conquer. Now wasn't there to resist. They were two people in a room of silence and survival, doing what they could to exist alongside each other. That moment rippled, even if no one spoke of it. The next morning, another cowboy brought 2 extra apples and left them on the edge of the prep table without a word. Later, one of the women sewed a patch onto the ripped sleeve of a worker's shirt and said nothing. These were not grand gestures. They were quiet ones. And perhaps that's why they mattered more. Now never told anyone why she offered the steak. Maybe she didn't know herself. Maybe it wasn't a reason, but a response to the letter she never read, to the silence that had followed her across the sea, to the confusion that had become more familiar than fear. And the cowboy never mentioned it either. But he looked her in the eye the next time he passed, and that was enough. Sometimes peace doesn't come through treaties or trumpets. Sometimes it comes in the form of a sliver of meat, held out with trembling hands and received with quiet thanks. Not friendship, but understanding. Not a meal, but a moment, a single bite, shared, and something unnamed, healed. The day of departure arrived quietly. There were no speeches, no flags raised or lowered, just the sound of boots on gravel, of suitcases snapping shut, and the distant shuffle of cattle beyond the fences. The women stood in a line near the main gate of the Texas ranch camp, heavier now in both body and thought. Some had gained 10, 15 pounds. Others had regained something less visible, the shape of their own presence. Hannah folded her uniform carefully, the cotton thinner now than when she had arrived. She didn't plan to wear it again. Instead, she placed it into her bag beside a small bundle of letters she had never sent. Then, before closing the zipper, she added a single napkin, wrinkled, stained with a faint ring of grease. The napkin from that first steak dinner. It was ridiculous, really. A scrap of cloth from a country she had been taught to hate. But she folded it with reverence, as if it were silk, and tucked it among her belongings like a holy relic. The buses arrived just after sunrise. The cowboys stood nearby, awkward in their stillness. A few tipped their hats. Others pretended to fix things that didn't need fixing: reins, latches, tools already cleaned. One of them, the same one who'd once mimed how to use a fork, walked past Nao and murmured, "Safe travels, ma'am." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her bow was slight but deliberate. And that was more than enough. They had come to this place expecting cages, punishment, perhaps starvation. What they received instead was harder to understand. Decency, a strange and subtle grace that fed more than their stomachs. It was the hot sun that didn't burn, the barbed wire that never bit, the steak that wasn't a taunt but a gesture. And now, as they boarded the bus, they carried home not scars, but questions. What did it mean to be cared for by your enemy? What did it mean to be treated like a woman again, not a weapon, not a symbol, but a person? As the engine roared and the countryside began to blur, Hannah stared out the window. A cowboy stood at the edge of the property, hands in his pockets, chewing a stalk of wheat. He didn't wave, but he didn't look away either. Neither did she. In her lap, her hands curled over the napkin in her bag, they had fed her, not as victory, not as propaganda, but as people who had watched too much death already and wanted something else. The war was not undone. Her past still lived inside her, the hunger, the shame, the duty. But now, beside all of that, lived another memory, one not of bombs, but of broth. Not of screaming, but of silence broken by kindness. She would return to Japan heavier. Yes, with body, with doubt, with history. But she would not return hollow. The others felt it too. Some sat in silence. Others whispered as the landscape passed. A few smiled. though they didn't know why. They were not free in the usual sense. But something had shifted. The uniforms had come off. The rules had bent. And they had learned in small, quiet increments that dignity isn't given by power. It's reclaimed in the moments when someone feeds you, not to dominate, but to understand. When they had first arrived, she had pointed at the stake in confusion. Now, she would point at it differently as proof that the world, even after fire, could hold gentleness. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering the moments history nearly forgot.